Welcome to Parley at the Hindu, where we try and bring together a 360-degree view of one of the biggest issues of the day. It's been nearly 400 days since the October 7th terror attacks, and Israel's bombardment of Gaza began. The death toll continues to climb, past 40,000, past 43,000 now, without an end in sight, or so it seems. So many are asking, why has the international mechanisms meant for peace, security, governance, justice, all failed to stop Israel? And is the global world order now in peril due to this conflict, as well as other wars and conflicts around the world? With me to discuss this very, very sort of weighty issue, it's a complex issue, are two real experts. Ambassador Navtej Sarna, he's an author, formerly a diplomat. He served as India's envoy to the UK, to the United States, and to Israel, and has written a book, of course, about his time in Israel. Also joining us from Washington, D.C. is Trita Parsi. He's the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute in Washington. He convened and collated what's called the Better Order Project to talk about ways to re-energize this international world order, and particularly the United Nations. So to begin with, thank you, Navtej, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Suhas, for inviting us. Thank you.
And thank you, Trita. If I could just start with what's happened right now, because there are so many parts of the last year that has defied international order, if you like, whether it has been, the banning of the UN Secretary General from Israel, the killings of United Nations workers, or whether it has been the defiance of the consistent UN General Assembly resolutions calling for a ceasefire in Israel and Gaza. The latest that we saw in November, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants. This was for the Israeli Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, Yoav, Gallant, as well as a Hamas leader. The warrant has been rejected by Israel, but also the United States and several other countries. In fact, the reaction of just the Western world that subscribes normally to these international organizations seems quite divided. I wanted to begin by asking you, Trita, if I may, what really has invoked such polarization over the Israel war in Gaza that we've not seen on other conflicts where, obviously the Russia war in Ukraine comes to mind, where the Western world order really came together?
Well, I think the simple answer to that is because this is a genocide and it's happening right in front of us on our phones. We can see it happening live. We're talking about far more than 43,000 deaths. I mean, some of the medical journals, The Lancet, for instance, has an estimation that puts it above 200,000, because the 43,000 is only the number of people who have been confirmed by the hospitals, which means that someone was injured and brought into the hospital. It's not all of the thousands of people that are under the rubble. And if you see any images of Gaza, there's hardly anything left of that place. And the vast majority of the people killed are also children. And women. And we have numerous eyewitnesses by doctors, surgeons, nurses from Western countries who have traveled there, who are seeing a systematic execution of children with bullets to their heads or to their chests in ways that, according to these doctors, are impossible to occur accidentally, given the frequency in which they happen. So I'm not surprised by the world's outrage. I'm not surprised by the manner in which people are revolting over this, compared to, for instance, in Ukraine. I mean, just as a comparison, roughly 700 children were killed in Ukraine through Russian bombardment over the course of 2.5 years. We're talking about more than 20,000 children killed in Gaza in just a few months more than a year. So the intensity of this, exceeds anything we have seen in any modern war. What is surprising is America's reaction. It's the Biden administration's reaction that has just lifted all regulations, all standards, including American law, in order to allow the Israelis to do exactly what they want. This has never happened before. Very, very pro-Israeli administrations, such as the George Bush administration, for instance, never allowed anything like this. In fact, put a stop to it. and even condemned one of Israel's assassinations of a Hamas leader because 7 other people were killed in that raid. Whereas now you're seeing the Israelis dropping 85 bombs on massive buildings in Beirut to kill the Hezbollah leader with hundreds of collateral damage and a congratulatory note from the Biden administration rather than a condemnation. So if we remind ourselves of how warlike and aggressive the Bush administration was perceived to be, and I think correctly perceived to be, what we're seeing Biden do exceeds that with a magnitude that is just absolutely shocking.
Of course, I just want to say you've used the term genocide. That's a very specific term meant to refer to the acts committed with the intent to destroy and whole or part a national or an ethnic or a racial or religious group. Of course, Israel has invoked, and many other countries, we hear it from the United States, from France, from the UK, they have invoked the UN conventions on the right to self-defense. So my question really is, why on this issue is the Western world so divided? We see France saying we would not arrest Mr. Netanyahu under the ICC, but then we have Canada and the United Kingdom saying they would fulfill their obligations. At a time that otherwise you see so much, perhaps NATO solidarity and consensus, why do you think on the Israel issue they've been so divided?
Well, I think what we're seeing right now is a situation in which the United States itself, over the course of the last couple of years, and particularly in the last few years, have really shifted away from supporting the very same international institutions, regulations, and laws that it itself played a crucial role in establishing. It has shifted away from that and is opting instead for what it calls the rules-based international order. I think it's very crucial to understand the difference between the post-World War II order and what Biden refers to as the rules-based order. The post-World War II order was based on international law. Law is adopted consensually in the sense that countries sign on to treaties, conventions, etc., and are bound by the things that they sign on to in general. Then, of course, you have UN Security Council resolutions, and the authority of the Security Council, of course, was a pivotal element of this order. The rules-based order is not centered on law. It's centered on rules. And it's completely unclear who actually makes those rules. In reality, it ends up being a coalition of a willing partnership of countries, Western countries, that essentially decide the rules for everyone else to follow. Part of the reason why this is attractive to the United States is because it is increasingly viewing international law and those institutions as being constraining on its power, whereas in a rules-based order, it will give the United States far more leeway to do what it wants and essentially extend the unipolar moment beyond what unipolarity actually itself has enabled to survive. In this scenario, part of what the United States is offering countries that sign on to this rules-based order, and I use that word specifically because in the 2022 National Security Strategy document of the Biden administration, they specifically say that countries that subscribe to the rules-based order, essentially talking about it not as a governing structure, but as a bloc, that countries that subscribe to the rules-based order will also receive military support from the United States. So almost a NATO plus rather than a global governing structure. As part of that, it is then also willing to set aside international law, regulations, institutions for those countries that essentially subscribe to this rules-based order. None, of course, will get that treatment more charitably than Israel will because of other historical reasons of the US's relationship with Israel. But what we're seeing is a deliberate hollowing out of international institutions and international law in a way that I personally think is tremendously dangerous because, frankly, the rules-based order instrument is an anti-status quo. It is a revisionist instrument that is hollowing out an international law-centered order with all of its flaws, nevertheless, is probably the best option we have for retaining some degree of order and stability in the future.
Right. I certainly want to come to the international world order, but Ambassador Sarna, Navtej, if I may, I wanted to ask you, since you have served in Israel, you've served in the United States, you were also a senior official at the Ministry of External Affairs dealing with the United Nations. Why do you think that on this issue, and it seems as if the last year has actually exacerbated this kind of a different standard, if you like, for Western countries on how Israel has been treated. Why do you think that we are seeing this kind of division?
No, thank you, Suhasini. I think, let me go back to your basic question and then come to the UN. What countries do in the UN, what they do outside the UN. So the fact remains that Israel is a special case. Let's face it. As far as the US is concerned, and as far as much of, for want of a better word, the West is concerned. The reasons are several, and we need not go into all of them. The fact is that with the United States, it's a sort of umbilical relationship with Israel. The US has felt, for reasons of its own, as that Israel is their country in the Middle East for oil to begin with, and thereafter as a linchpin which needs to be protected at all costs. Now, the protection is one for strategic reasons, and the rest is a sort of a moral burden that is felt there. That because of Jewish homeland being Israel after the Holocaust, there is a need to protect this and not let them lose the homeland. I'm giving you the theory behind it.
Sure.
The second thing is that this is a democracy. It's a vulnerable democracy in a very hard neighborhood. What is not stated is that, it's the nuclear power against a potential nuclear power that could be Iran. Now, if you look at all these different aspects, Israel's democracy comes up against the fact that Israel has also been an occupying power. Now, what Israel does in Gaza and West Bank does not gel right with it being the only democracy in the Middle East. But that has been overlooked. The second, the old reason for Israel's need to be protected by the United States, well, that's under question. Israel is a very powerful country. And the relations with the Arab countries have evolved over the decades into something very different from what they were in 48, when Israel had to fight for its survival against combined 5 Arab armies. In Europe, there is a huge amount of, again, with some countries it's guilt, and it is that it is the core of our foreign policy is to support Israel. So it's become a kind of an issue in both West Europe, largely, and in the United States. I'm not talking of the current campus protests and otherwise, but it's become an issue in the foreign policy establishments that this relationship is beyond question. And president after president has said that. I think Biden it was who said that if there was no Israel, we'd have to invent one.
Right.
Reagan said that there's no other country like the United States except Israel. So there is this very strong bond, if you call it, but which is, of course, maintained and fed by a very long, very, very strong lobby in the United States. I mean, people get criticized strongly for calling this the Zionist lobby or the Israel lobby, but the fact is that the Jewish lobbies in Israel, they may not always agree with all the Zionist activity that goes on in Israel, but they are when push comes to shove, they want to do everything to protect Israel. And this also includes mega donors in the American political system. And congressmen, as you know, need to be elected every 2 years and they need a lot of money for
So
it.
it has to do with the political side, the funding as
Yes.
well. I wanted to ask you about one technicality. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, go on, then I'll come back. Yeah.
No, why don't you finish this thought? Because I wanted to come
So,
back to the
so
ICC.
the fact is that when, there is this blind spot on Israel, a very deliberate blind spot, when you have arms, technology, $3 billion a year being given to Israel, and Israel can not be seen to be doing any wrong. And I think Trita has rightly pointed out that no time has it been more obvious, more in your face than under President Biden. And no time has the annihilation of the Palestinians, civilians. I'm not talking of Hamas. I'm talking of civilian people been so brutal as what we have seen in the last 1 year. So, for a variety of reasons, there is this major lacunae in this rule-based international order, that the rules are for somebody else, not for Israel and not for us. And therefore, when it comes to the warrants, the question you started with, if you see the split reaction, it essentially stems from these political positions.
Sure. Trita, you wanted to come in quickly?
Yes, I strongly agree with Navtej. She's absolutely right when it comes to the influence of the pro-Israeli lobby here, or I would usually call them the pro-Likud lobby, because there's other pro-Israeli lobbies that are very much opposed to many of the things that particularly the Netanyahu government has done. And I think also the historical analysis is absolutely correct. I would point out a few things, though. What we're seeing now is really different from any level of American support before. In 1982, when Begin was bombing Lebanon and American TV was showing what was happening in Lebanon live, Reagan got really upset. He called Begin and told him that this is a genocide. He actually used the word genocide. And of course, upset Begin tremendously, but then he essentially threatened him and say, if you don't stop this, I will stop the shipment of certain weapons, particularly, I think it was jet planes. And within 20 minutes, Begin ordered Ariel Sharon to pull back from Lebanon. So,
and this time that's clearly not happened.
Exactly. So my point is that this is beyond the regular pro-Israeli tilt that we have seen historically. This goes way beyond that, because it's also in clear violation of U.S. law. U.S. law itself does not allow shipment of weapons to an army that is obstructing aid, particularly aid coming in from the United States to civilians. The State Department's own investigation clearly showed that that is what the Israelis are doing. Antony Blinken lied in the Senate and declared that that was not the conclusion State Department had reached, even though it was. And you had several people resigning over this. So this goes far beyond anything we have seen in the past. And we have to have an explanation for it that goes beyond just the traditional pro-Israeli tilt that has existed in the United States. Moreover, I think it's also important to recognize, because I think Navtej is quite correct in pointing out that there's an argument being made that this is the case, this is a special treatment because Israel is a democracy. Now, of course, whether it actually is a democracy is questionable, mindful of the fact that you have so many respected human rights organizations.
Right. I mean, I'm trying to bring this back to the question on the international order. In fact, what you pointed out.
I'm actually getting to that point, because I'm getting to that, because the argument essentially being that because they're a democracy, the rules do not apply to them, is something that is starting to take hold, particularly in Europe. But if you try to establish a world order in which you have two sets of rules for those who are democracies or self-defined democracies, even though if they are an apartheid state, and rules for those who are not democracies by Western standards, you're not going to have a stable world order. International law is blind to the internal political organization of countries. This was a crucial reality that was needed in order to make sure that countries that have deep differences deep, different organizations, nevertheless could be able to coexist peacefully. If we change that, which is again what is happening in the West, we are going down a path of tremendous instability. We will move not towards a multipolar world, but to a multi-order world, in which the differences and arguments will not be over the interpretation of law, but rather two different sets of laws. And that is a recipe for absolute disaster. And that is unfortunately the direction that the Biden administration took us in. It will be interesting to see where Trump will take us, mindful of the fact that he neither cares about law or rules.
Sure. And I'd like to come to that as well. Trita, if I could ask you on a technicality, since you covered this, the fact is, and as you pointed out, Israel is unique in the sense it's the first democratically elected leader to be indicted. ICC has indicted, I think, 67 people so far. All of them really came from countries not seen as democracies. Israel itself has said the warrant makes no sense because Israel is not a participant state in the ICC, like India isn't. However, the ICC has ruled that Palestine is. Where do you think the truth lies on this? That can a warrant be issued against Prime Minister Netanyahu when Israel doesn't actually adhere to the ICC?
Of course it can, because Israel is conducting this genocide in some other country's territory. And so just because the United States is not necessarily part of the ICC, if the United States does something in a country that is a different story. And I think, so this was something the ICC dealt with first before even taking up this issue. And I think it's really important to understand that when some European countries are distancing themselves from the ICC, what they're really doing is that they're sacrificing international law and international institutions for this, not just an Israeli exception, but an exception for all of themselves, from the very institutions that they worked so hard to establish. As someone who grew up in Europe, I have to say this is quite shocking, because international law, dialogue, multilateralism was the religion of Europe for such a long time. The speed in which European countries have now essentially tossed that aside is quite stunning. And one can definitely see, as a realist myself, scenarios in which countries would do so when they feel that a vital interest of their own is at stake. No one has belief that international law will hold in all scenarios. In a scenario in which a vital interest is at stake, expectations is that countries will set it aside, unfortunately. But to set it aside for some other countries' right and ability to be able to conduct what the UN itself in a report just determined to be compatible with the characteristics of genocide, that is stunning.
Right. Navtej, if I could get in just on the India side of this, because of course, India is not a participant country in the ICC. I think you were in fact the spokesperson when that decision was taken in the early 2000s. I did want to get a sense from you of how India sees this debate play out, because it is not just the Netanyahu arrest warrant. Before this, in 2023, there was the ICC arrest warrant against Russian President Vladimir Putin, other Russian ministers as well. And India at that time, too, had not accepted these warrants. Give us a sense of what exactly India's objections to the ICC were, and how India's position on the situation with Israel today has evolved.
Well, thank you, Suhasini. I think before I'll respond to that question, but just one point from what was being said. I think the warrants itself is not the issue of what was being done to international law, particularly international humanitarian law. And so countries may react to the warrants one way or the other. But what the sad part is that international humanitarian law has been flouted now for months. And it's in 24/7 visibility of the world. And therefore, everybody has, people have not really done what they should have been doing as countries. A lot of the US performance, I call it, diplomatic performance, has been performative. Because, if they really wanted to stop this, the fact is that the US could have stopped it. So, Biden has taken the position that I really want to, but I can't. Now, which is somewhat difficult to believe for the most powerful man in the world. Coming to India's position regarding the ICC, you see, has only 124 member states, and we participated in the negotiations in the prepcom that led up to the setting up of the ICC. We participated in the negotiations of the Rome Statute, and we did not sign it, and we did not ratify it, of course. Now that we have also, that happens with other countries also, because India does negotiate in good faith, and when they find that they can't agree to some of the terms, they simply don't sign rather than sign and flout it. So India did not sign. If I recall correctly, the reasons for not signing were the fact that it did not give sufficient play or place for national institutions, particularly our national administrative and judicial institutions. It did not recognize the use of nuclear weapons and the use of weapons of mass destruction as a crime which could be punished. It did not recognize terrorism, which was, I think, probably the breaking point. It's too far long back for me to remember the exact sequence, but I think that was probably the breaking point, that terrorism is a crime and India was suffering. And, that this should also be included, that was not accepted. And there was also a difference of view on how much powers of referral and deferment should be given to the UN Security Council. It's a bit odd because, the UN Security Council most important member is not part of the ICC. But so these were a set of situations, and we did not join the ICC. On how we have reacted to the warrants, I think there is all I could find really was one statement, short statement by our External Affairs Minister, who said that, we're not party to this institution, so that should tell you what we think about it. So I think that could be read as broadly, without getting into detail, a broadly dismissive sort of statement, or without getting into specifics.
And on both these cases, even off the record, that's what officials say. To turn now from what the ICC has done to what you were mentioning, the UN Security Council. Over the last 2 years, we have seen the UN Security Council practically bound and logjammed over first Russia's war in Ukraine and then Israel's war in Gaza because of the vetoes from either Russia or the United States. And on a number of resolutions where they have actually made some progress in the last couple of years. We've seen a series of resolutions on Afghanistan. They've had no impact. Afghanistan's regime, the Taliban, continues its very discriminatory practices against women in particular, but it's not just gender. In Myanmar, despite UN Security Council resolutions, we actually see no headway being made against the junta. Do you think that we are now reaching a point where the international world order, as is defined by these institutions, is actually, unable to function? And is there a short answer on what would it take to make states comply?
You're absolutely right. It's been, UN Security Council resolutions don't mean a thing anymore. And, if again, in the particular case of Israel, the US veto is used almost automatically. I think there's a figure which says that half of the US vetoes that have been used have been to protect Israel. And naturally, Russia is going to use its veto for its own purposes. So the fact remains that the situation in which the UN was formed, in which the UN Security Council was formed, the membership of the UN Security Council, all that needs evolution. The world has changed from 1945. The UN Security Council believes it can still deliver. It just simply can't. And therefore, given the fact that the mood in the UN Security Council or the efficacy of the UN Security Council is so different sometimes from the mood that comes in the UNGA, that the UN has become completely dysfunctional. And my short answer to all this talk about international order is simply that every country today has decided to live on a transactional, immediate, short-term policy paradigm. There is no value-based international relations. There is no, something which is for the general good. I don't mean to say that countries did not work in national interest earlier. They always do and they always will. But to the sort of the brazenness of realpolitik that has taken hold of the world today, you cannot bring that brazenness into a room and expect compromise. So I think that is it until that changes, and I don't see any signs it's probably going to increase. These things will break down. Whether you see trade, the WTO is becoming dysfunctional. Whether you see climate negotiations, I mean, it's a joke. People spend more on the climate negotiations than they'll get for renewable transition.
Right.
So,
Trita, do you want to come in on that? On the idea that, the international world order is dysfunctional. Israel's continued war in Gaza seems to show just how dysfunctional it is. And is there, according to you, you presented this report on the better world order, is there, according to you, a short answer to how to fix it?
Not a short answer, but again, I find myself in agreement with Navtej's assessment. We are in a very, very bad situation. Countries are becoming more transactional. However, I don't think that necessarily means that ultimately there will be a collective desire not to have any rules and laws that will guide state-to-state conduct. At the end of the day, we can point to all of these examples in which clearly the system has not worked, but those are, at the end of the day, perhaps 5% of the interactions that are taking place in the world. There is so much interaction that is taking place in which laws are being followed because the transaction cost of international relations is so much lower when everyone follows these different rules. The predictability is tremendously valuable. Yes, there are unfortunately an increasing number of cases in which it is not followed, but to throw out everything because of that, I think would be a mistake. I fear that we may be moving in that direction. But as we do, I do think that as the world becomes more multipolar as well, there will be a renewed interest in trying to find something to make sure that the worst outcomes of an entirely transactional world are minimized. And that is going to reignite an interest in some form of regulatory system. My hope is that we don't go so far that it becomes too late to save some of the fundamental structures that do exist. The Security Council, again, is absolutely right, absolutely needs reform. It has become a joke, and at some point it will become irrelevant. At that point, the question is, will even the great powers not recognize that they are actually better off having a somewhat functioning Security Council, mindful of the fact that they have vetoes, than not to have a Security Council at all? So my view is that things are going to get worse, but at some point, there's going to be a tipping point in which a critical mass of countries will recognize that it's actually in their interest to make sure that there is some sort of a functioning governing system, and that will generate renewed interest in fixing this. The question is if it will be too late by then.
Right. And final question, Trita, on Israel in particular, you mentioned that the presidency of Donald Trump is not likely to rein in Israel in any sense. Do you see Israel being brought to account, or at least being pushed into a ceasefire in Gaza anytime soon?
Actually, I do think that there is a likelihood that it will happen because Trump, at the end of the day, does not really follow any American convention. He is more about himself than anything else. And as much as he sees transactional value of being pro-Israel, etc., I think more than anything else, he does not want to see the United States get dragged into another war in the Middle East. Right. And if the escalatory situation there continues, I can actually see him being much more forceful in putting pressure on Israel to wrap this up than Biden was and what Kamala Harris likely would have been. I mean, it's fascinating that Trump could say on the campaign trail that he wants to see the killing stop, which is a very simple and unobjectionable statement. Kamala Harris could not bring herself to even say that.
But
So
he's likely to want it done. Navtej, would you agree?
Well, I think Donald Trump's main motivation is that he wants to show himself as the ultimate winner. And the ultimate winner is that I told you I'll stop the wars, so I stopped the wars. So he may have told Netanyahu that, you've got 2 months, do whatever you want. In fact, that's what people say he's told him. Do whatever you want, and then stop the bombing on 20th of January. And that is ceasefire. That may happen, because by that time, Netanyahu may have reached a point where he could declare victory also. But all I want to say is a ceasefire will not mean peace. Because the next step that Donald Trump will want is to go back to Abraham Accords, which will be more difficult than it was in Trump 1.0. The landscape has changed considerably.
So you may see a ceasefire, but there won't be a return to.
You may see a ceasefire, but there is no return because there is no movement we can see so far against towards actual political process starting to discuss, the Palestinian issue.
Question, which is
and until you get to the heart of the problem, you will buy time, and something else will happen.
It's a conversation that we can continue to have, but we are running out of time here. But I'd really like to thank you, Navtej Sarna, Trita Parsi, for joining us on this debate to look at where the international rules-based order really goes after these conflicts that we've seen. If you have been, thanks so much for listening. The transcript will be available on www.thehindu.com.